At 19 years old, Sui Cruise made a decision that would echo across the world. She chose a name that wasn't her father's, a life that wasn't scripted by Hollywood, and a voice that had been silent for far too long. This is not a story about fame or celebrity scandal. This is a story about a girl who grew up in the shadow of the brightest spotlight on earth and learned what it means to reclaim your own narrative. This is the truth she has been carrying since childhood, and it's finally time to listen. Every child deserves to know their father. Not the version that appears on movie screens or in magazine covers, not the public persona that millions adore, but the real person, flawed, present, willing to show up even when it's difficult. For Sui Cruise, that simple childhood right was stolen before she was old enough to understand what was being taken from her. Born in 2006 to two of Hollywood's most recognizable figures, her entrance into the world was already unusual. Following the strict Scientology tradition of silent birth, her mother Katie Holmes remained silent during labor, adhering to church doctrine while medical professionals and church officials stood witness. What should have been a moment of pure celebration became a moment of compliance, control, and the beginning of a narrative Sui did not choose. The first years of Sui's life appeared perfect from the outside. Red carpets, designer clothes, magazine spreads, exclusive resorts, and the carefully curated image of a Hollywood power couple with their beautiful daughter. The world saw what it was meant to see, a family that seemed to have everything. But behind the gates of their Los Angeles mansion, a different story was unfolding. Katie Holmes' parents grew increasingly concerned about their daughter's involvement with Scientology and the influence it exerted over her daily life. Reports from those close to the family painted a picture of constant surveillance, handlers dressed in black, and a woman who felt monitored even in her own home. Katie couldn't make a phone call without someone watching. She couldn't leave without reporting her whereabouts. She existed in a state of controlled freedom, and her daughter existed within that same constrained world. Young Sui didn't understand the complexities of her mother's situation. All she knew was that she had a father who seemed larger than life, who would pick her up and swing her around, who held her hand on the streets of New York, and who made the world feel safe. Then, on a day in June 2012, that world collapsed. Katie Holmes filed for divorce just days before Tom Cruise's 50th birthday, and the way she did it was strategic, calculated, and desperate. She filed while Tom was out of the country filming in Iceland, ensuring he would discover the news the same way the rest of the world did, through headlines and press releases. It was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in survival mode, by a woman who believed her daughter was in danger of being pulled into the religious machinery of an organization she fundamentally rejected. To the media, it was Hollywood's fastest and most shocking separation. Celebrity journalists speculated about irreconcilable differences and lifestyle changes. Entertainment outlets dissected every detail they could uncover. But for 6-year-old Sui, the narrative was infinitely simpler and infinitely more painful. Her father disappeared. Not gradually, not with time to adjust, but suddenly and completely. The footsteps in the hallway stopped. The warm hand that had held hers became a memory. The man who had been a constant presence in her early life became a ghost, visible everywhere on screens and billboards but nowhere in her actual existence. What Sui would learn years later was that her mother had not made an impulsive choice. Katie Holmes had been planning her escape with meticulous precision. She had changed phones repeatedly, avoided certain areas of their home she believed were monitored, replaced staff members she suspected of reporting back to the church, and held her daughter a little tighter each night, terrified of what losing custody would mean. She knew the Scientology organization well enough to understand that the church discouraged relationships with people who were not members. She understood that if Sui remained in that environment as she grew older, she could be pressured to join the Sea Org, the church's most extreme organization, where members sign billion-year contracts and surrender most of their autonomy and personal freedoms. The New York courts proved to be Katie's ally. She chose that jurisdiction deliberately, knowing that New York law favored the custodial parent seeking to establish a child's stability and well-being outside a potentially harmful influence. By July 2012, less than 2 weeks after filing, the divorce was finalized. Tom agreed to pay approximately $400,000 annually in child support, cover medical and educational expenses, and accept that his ex-wife would have primary custody. But the most significant clause in the settlement was the one Katie had fought for with everything she had, her right to raise Sui outside Scientology. Then, like people disappearing into a new life, Katie and Sui left Los Angeles with only a few suitcases and an ocean of hope that distance could save them. They moved to New York City, a place where faces blended into millions of other faces, where a mother and daughter could become anonymous. Sui's father existed everywhere in that new world, on movie posters in Times Square, on magazine covers in every bodega, in the voices of people who recognized his movies, but nowhere in her daily life. He was both omnipresent and completely absent, a paradox that would define her childhood. As the years passed, Sui developed an unusual relationship with her father. She knew him primarily through his public work. She saw him hanging from the sides of skyscrapers in movie scenes, performing stunts that seemed impossible, commanding armies of people on screen. She watched a man who dedicated his career to danger and adrenaline, a man who risked his body repeatedly for his art, but who apparently could not or would not risk crossing whatever invisible line separated him from his daughter. The contradiction was confusing. How could a man be so brave on screen yet so absent in real life? How could he be so committed to entertaining millions while being so unreachable to one specific person? By age 10, Sui's questions became sharper. Where is Dad? Why doesn't he come? She tried to convince herself he was simply busy, caught up in the demands of his career, too occupied with filming and premieres and obligations to Hollywood to think of a child he once called his miracle. But children eventually learn the difference between a busy schedule and a choice. When you're busy, you find time for the things that matter most. When you choose not to show up, you make that choice every single day. At 13, 14, 15, Sui was old enough to search for her own answers. She read interviews and watched documentaries about Scientology. She learned about the church's doctrine of disconnection, the practice of severing relationships with people who leave the organization or refuse to join. She read testimonies from former members who described being warned against maintaining close ties with people outside the church. She understood that she was outside, not a member, living with a mother who had rejected the organization entirely. She began to see her father's absence not as a mystery but as a symptom of a system that had prioritized ideology over family, doctrine over love. The realization was devastating. She wasn't waiting for a father who was busy or distracted or even unwilling. She was waiting for a father who existed in a world where the person she was, a girl outside the church, living with a mother who had rejected Scientology, made her someone he could not reach toward. The organization had built a wall between them, and whether he had helped build it or simply accepted it, the result was the same. She was on the other side, and he never came. This understanding arrived when Sui was old enough to process it but still young enough for it to fundamentally reshape how she saw herself and her place in the world. She was not rejected because she was unlovable. She was separated because she existed outside a belief system that demanded total loyalty. That was somehow both easier to understand and even more painful to accept. At 15, she came into the kitchen one morning and found her mother crying softly while reading an article about Tom's latest film premiere. Katie quickly wiped her eyes and tried to move on, but Sui saw. She understood without needing explanation that her mother had been carrying the weight of her daughter's abandonment silently for years. Katie had never spoken poorly of Tom to Sui. She had never poisoned the well or used bitterness as a weapon. Instead, she had held on to a belief that some truths are too painful for children to carry before they're ready to carry them. By 16, Sui was finally ready. Not for the media's truth, not for the public narrative, but for her own understanding of what had happened and what it meant. She began to separate the man her father portrayed to the world from the man he had chosen to be in her life, and the gap between those two people was enormous. The public Tom Cruise was brave, devoted, willing to risk everything for his art and his audience. The private Tom Cruise was a man who had not spoken to his daughter in years, who did not call on her birthday, who did not attend her school events or graduations or moments of significance. Then came April 2024. Sui turned 18, and with that birthday came a legal threshold that mattered profoundly. She was no longer a child. She was an adult capable of making her own decisions, telling her own story, and defining her own identity without permission from anyone, including the man whose surname she had carried since birth. In the weeks before her 18th birthday, she wrote her college application essays. She poured years of silence into sentences that shook admissions officers. She wrote about growing up in the space that love leaves behind, about learning to be independent before she was ready, about watching a father from a distance while he built a career saving fictional worlds. For the first time, she told her truth, and her truth was devastating. But Sui didn't stop at essays. At 18 years old, she made a decision that surprised no one who understood her journey but shocked the world that had been watching from a distance. On May 17, 2024, she legally changed her name from Sui Cruz to Sui Noel Holmes. She chose her mother's middle name as a tribute, a way of acknowledging the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her, who had carried her through a storm of privilege and pain, who had proven that love meant choosing your child's freedom over your own comfort. From the shadow of her father's celebrity, Katie visited her regularly, helping her settle into dorm life, carrying boxes with hands that were tired but grateful. She smiled the smile of a mother who had accomplished something nearly impossible, raising a daughter who had survived fame before she could even understand it, survived abandonment without hardening into bitterness, survived the weight of global media scrutiny and still emerged as a grounded, kind, driven human being. In a rare interview, Katie said simply, "She's an incredible person." But the people who understood Sui's journey knew that her resilience came directly from her mother's choices and her mother's love. Meanwhile, Tom Cruise continued living his life of extremes. He filmed blockbuster franchises, signed multi-million-dollar deals, prepared for films that would shoot partially in outer space with NASA support, and performed death-defying stunts that defied logic. The world cheered every time he hung from the outside of an airplane or scaled a building without safety equipment. He was celebrated as a man willing to risk everything for his craft. But what he never risked was the vulnerability required to rebuild a relationship with the daughter he had lost. According to those close to the family, there have been no phone calls, no private visits, no photographs together, no attempts to close the distance that has grown to nearly 13 years. Insiders report that Tom continues to pay for Sui's education and medical expenses, exactly as the 2012 settlement requires. Money can be sent from a distance. Presents can be delivered through lawyers. Financial obligations can be met without ever having to look into a person's eyes. But the things that cannot be delivered through payments are the things Sui waited for: a father's presence, his attention, his choice to prioritize her over whatever system or belief had separated them. What's striking about Sui's story is not that her father chose his career over his daughter. Many parents must balance work and family. It's that he chose his belief system over his daughter. He chose an organization's doctrine over a human being he created. He chose control over connection. And he chose silence in the face of her growing need to understand why. Now at 19, Sui has accepted this silence in a way that suggests maturity beyond her years. She no longer checks her phone on her birthday, hoping for a message that never comes. She no longer waits at the doorway of her memory for footsteps she will never hear again. She has redirected the energy she spent waiting into building her own identity, her own dreams, her own future. She has become the kind of person who doesn't need her father's validation because she has learned